Spider-Man: Homecoming marks the first film in the collaboration between Sony Pictures and Marvel Studios for the shared custody of Peter Parker. Needless to say that this movie has a lot riding on it, both for Sony Pictures, who are coming off a string of box office failures and are poised to have another one added to that list, and for Marvel Studios, who are introducing Spider-Man, their biggest money-making character, into the larger MCU. And while the film is not 100% perfect, it is one of the strongest Marvel movies in recent memory, and is thoroughly entertaining from start to finish. The movie wastes no time and jumps right into the story shortly after the Battle of New York. Adrian Toomes, played by Michael Keaton, has been hired along with his salvage company to remove Chitauri records from Grand Central Station. He is then informed by Anne-Marie Hogue, played by Tyne Daly, that a new public-private venture spearheaded by Stark Industries called Damage Control is taking over the operation. An angry Toomes then decides he's going to go in business for himself with the salvage he hasn't turned over. The story then cuts to 8 years later, where we find Peter Parker is already Spider-Man and is keeping a travel log of his appearance in Captain America: Civil War. Director John Watts makes sure the film is very well paced and doesn't overwhelm the audience with too many over-the-top, mind-numbing action sequences. Except for a few set-piece moments, the action is relatively small scale. Unlike in many other superhero movies, Spider-Man is not trying to save the world. He's not even trying to save New York. He's just trying to protect his own little corner of it. It's those very real-world stakes that keeps the film grounded. The film also shows Peter Parker dealing with his life outside of being a superhero. He gets into trouble at school, he gets into fights with his Aunt May, played magnificently by Marissa Tomei, and he's overall trying to find the right balance between being Spider-Man and being an ordinary teenager, and trying to keep those two lives separate. Tom Holland is outstanding as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and avoids the trap that many superhero films, and a couple of Spider-Man films in particular, have fallen into. That being the hero's public persona is exactly the same as his secret identity. Holland is a near-perfect page-to-screen adaptation as we've seen of Spider-Man and Peter Parker since Tobey Maguire's first film in 2002. And even though the story moves beyond the typical superhero origin story, this is still a relatively new Spider-Man who is still trying to find his footing and adapt to his powers. Michael Keaton as Adrian Toomes provides the best villain in a Marvel movie probably since Loki or even the Red Skull in Captain America: First Avenger. His motivations go beyond being evil just for the sake of being evil and is a fully fleshed out character from head to toe. Laura Harrier is excellent as Liz Allen, the love interest of Peter Parker, and even though she doesn't have a lot of dialogue, she works well with what's given to her. Jacob Batalon, who plays Peter Parker's best friend, Ned Leeds, provides some much-needed comic relief to break the tension, and seems like the type of best friend a guy like Peter Parker would have in high school. Zendaya Coleman as Michelle really doesn't have a lot to do in this movie. She provides some well-placed snarky quips and possibly sets up a love interest for the next movie. Robert Downey Jr., as always, is great as Tony Stark, but this time he is in a more paternal role, being a much-needed superhero father figure to Peter. And even though there was much trepidation about Marissa Tomei playing a younger and, quite frankly, hotter version of May Parker, it not only works, but it works astonishingly well. But the weakest link in the cast is Tony Revolori's portrayal of Peter Parker's bully and main rival, Flash Thompson. The character is a complete departure from the traditional Flash Thompson in the comics, and isn't really a bully, he's just an asshole. He's also no longer a physically imposing stereotypical jock. He's now a DJ. And that's where the character completely falls apart. It is simply not believable that Flash Thompson, who is physically smaller than Peter Parker, would be able to verbally abuse him without getting his ass kicked by somebody.
Kick his ass! Kick his ass! Kick his ass! Kick his ass! Kick his ass!
The entire character smacks of trying too hard to fit in with a millennial-friendly take on the character. And you can't help but wonder if the character was changed from a football player into a DJ in a boardroom in order to make the film seem slightly less American. Revolori's presence, however, is offset by the long-overdue return of Jon Favreau as Happy Hogan. Hogan, who is tasked with looking after Peter by Tony Stark, is not only unwilling, but also, quite frankly, annoyed. And it's that annoyance that perfectly counterbalances Peter Parker's over-exuberance. The bright color palette of the film makes for some engaging visuals, and captures New York, and especially Queens, as a living, breathing city, but different from the Midtown we know from the Avengers movies. Where Tony Stark's world is filled with tall skyscrapers, Peter Parker's world is filled with apartment buildings and bodegas and residents going about their day-to-day lives. We have bright reds, blues, and oranges, which are far more pleasing to the eye and give the film a lighter mood than the standard superhero gray, black, and brown earth tones that many directors use to convey a dark and gritty feel. One scene even uses those brighter colors in a very creative way, showing that bright and colorful can be just as visually dramatic as dark and gritty black and gray. The film, while set in the present day, takes many cues from 80s teen comedies, especially from director John Hughes. One scene even pays tribute to the late director by visually calling back to one of Hughes' most memorable films, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Even though these are supposedly modern teenagers, the film's soundtrack has a plethora of songs from the 70s and 80s, and even appropriately pays tribute to Forest Hill's Queen's very own, the Ramones. While not a comedy per se, Spider-Man: Homecoming is definitely a lighter film, but with some very well-placed dramatic moments. The humor is used to provide a much-needed break in the tension, but it never feels out of place. Even though this is one of the more suggestive movies in the Marvel stable in terms of dialogue, it never feels gratuitous, and at no point does it feel inappropriate for younger audience members. Teenagers speak like actual teenagers, and adults don't condescend to them, which is very refreshing in a movie like this. And as previously stated, the film doesn't overly rely on huge set pieces, which has been a criticism of many superhero movies of late. So the question remains, is this the best Spider-Man movie? The legacy of the Sam Raimi movies cast a very long shadow. Well, the first two at least. And the Andrew Garfield movies, well, the less we say about those, the better. While not as good as the first Sam Raimi film, and definitely not as good as the second, it still is entertaining, but unfortunately it has a few faults that are just too large to ignore. It will take a few years and multiple viewings to properly assess where this film stacks up among those. Overall, Spider-Man Homecoming is a good film, with a few glaring problems keeping it from being a great one. Even still, this is one of the better Marvel movies to date, and it makes a welcome addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Spider-Man Homecoming gets 4.5 out of 6 Chewbaccas. That's it for now. See you next time.
Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the Mets are gonna